Born of 21st century conflict and instability in the Middle East, ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, has emerged in recent years as one of the most violent extremist groups to terrorize this troubled region in modern history. More than just a terrorist or revolutionary group, ISIS has seized control of large transnational territories, destroyed precious antiquities and significant historic sites, raised vast sums of capital through extortion and black markets, and recruited new members from around the world and spread news of its horrific actions through aggressive use of the most modern digital communication technology and social media. All of this against the backdrop of the Syrian civil war, in which there are multiple native and international players, including the United States, and most recently Russia, with multiple and evolving agendas. To help us all better understand what ISIS is and the events and convoluted history that have led to the present state of affairs, Troy Trojan Vision has assembled an expert panel of Troy University faculty and staff members whose research and real-world experience shed light on ISIS, the Syrian civil war, and the way forward. Michael O. Slobodchikoff is moderator for the panel. Dr. Slobodchikoff has published several peer-reviewed articles. His first book, entitled Strategic Cooperation: Overcoming the Barriers of Global Anarchy, was published in 2013, while his current book, entitled Building Hegemonic Order Russia's Way: Rules, Stability, and Predictability in the Post-Soviet Space, was published in 2014. He is an assistant professor of political science at Troy University. He specializes in relations between Russia and the former Soviet states, international conflict and peace, and comparative politics. He is a regular contributor to Russia Direct and has often served as an analyst on Russian relations with Ukraine for BBC World News, as well as Voice of Russia Radio.
Hello and welcome. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq and created a situation where we saw a lot of sectarian violence develop. We had a lot of new groups fighting the United States and its influence in Iraq, such as Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And Al-Qaeda in Iraq morphed into the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, what we call ISIS. The Islamist militant group that has seized a chunk of land stretching from northern Syria to central Iraq, and it has struck fear into the hearts of leaders around the world. The group began in 2004 and was rebranded as ISIS 2 years later. It was an ally of Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda, although they later claimed that Al-Qaeda was not Islamic enough, and it disowned the group in early 2014. It has been proven to be more brutal and more effective at controlling territory it has seized. When it has seized new territory, it has used extortion and other means to gain money, as well as selling oil on the black market, and so it has become very rich doing so to finance the war that it has unleashed on the Middle East. In 2011, a civil war broke out in Syria. Bashar al-Assad was under siege by many different groups. The United States has taken a position of being against Bashar al-Assad, but there are many rebel groups fighting, including ISIS, among others. Currently, we have a situation where there are many different governments trying to defeat ISIS, as well as fighting in the Middle East against Assad. The Russians are there to protect Assad and have started fighting and bombing not only ISIS, but also elements that are against Assad who are allies of the United States. So the situation is very tenuous at best, and the situation is constantly devolving on a day-to-day basis. So today I'd like to welcome our panelists. We have a bunch of experts in the field who can help us to understand more about what is going on with ISIS and with Syria as well. To my right here is Dr. Aaron Hagler. He is an assistant professor in the history department. and specializes in Middle Eastern history. He has published peer-review articles and book reviews. He earned his PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from the University of Pennsylvania in 2011 and has been teaching at Troy since 2014. He is currently working on a book on the First Muslim Civil War. To my left is Dr. G. Doug Davis, who has published peer-reviewed articles, book reviews, and book chapters. He is an associate professor of political science at Troy University, where he focuses on international relations, Eastern Europe, and European philosophy and theology. He is working on the Polish response to Marxism with several philosophy departments in Lublin, Warsaw, and Krakow. He also writes on Catholic theology, where he examines the thought of Karol Wojtyła and the linkages between Thomist thought and phenomenology. Further, we have Major General Walter D. Gavan, who is our Senior Vice Chancellor for Advancement and Economic Development at Troy University. He is a native of Safford, Alabama, who earned a master's degree from Troy and served as the Vice Commander of Air University in Montgomery, where he oversaw all of the Air Force's higher education with the exception of the Air Force Academy, including the Community College of the Air Force, which is the world's largest community college system. He has also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in charge of U.S. Global Assistance Programs and as Commandant of the Air Force Institute of Technology in Dayton, Ohio, the Air Force's Graduate School of Engineering and Management, and as well as its Institution for Technical Professional Continuing Education. Thank you all for joining me today.
Thank you.
I want to start off with Dr. Hagler and ask that everyone talking about ISIS as being a new threat. However, radical Islam or Islamism has been around for a long time. Is ISIS and the threat that it poses a new issue?
Well, like the question highlights, Michael, it's both an old issue and a new issue. It's an old issue because ISIS understands itself as something old. When the Prophet Muhammad led the first Islamic community, he functioned as both a political leader and a religious leader. After he died, there was no one who could duplicate that role. The solution that the early Islamic community came up with some contention, was the idea of a caliph, someone who was a successor or a deputy to the Prophet or to God, who would function in the role of both political and religious leader, but not prophet. That was a compromise that worked until about the year 870, when the caliphs ultimately lost power, and there we saw what we would call here a separation of, if you'll pardon the term, church and state, where religious authority and political authority became separated between caliphs and sultans. Now, I realize I'm jumping ahead quite a bit, but after World War I, when the West came to dominate the Middle East, destroyed the Ottoman Empire, especially the British and the French, started ruling directly over parts of the Middle East, Islamism, this idea that the proper role of Islam was to be governance, that Islamic law should be secular law, started to gain traction. So that idea sort of started picking up right around World War I. And it grew and grew in the face of British and French domination, in the face of the establishment, foundation, and many successful wars fought by the State of Israel. There was this growing sense that Western forms of governance, Western ideas of nationalism, these things were foreign to the Middle East. And the response was to find something authentic. And the thing that they had that was authentic was Islam. And so these Islamist groups like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which we saw played such a prominent role in the tumult in Egypt that's gone on since the Arab Spring, was one of the first ones, but a lot of other ones grew, where the idea was you want to have more Islam in governance. And what ISIS wants is to reestablish that early caliphate, especially the immediate successors to the Prophet Muhammad. They look back on that as a kind of golden age. And as such, well, they're not the only Islamist group that feels that way. You mentioned Al-Qaeda. There are other groups that are Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. They all sound similar, but they're all different, and they have different philosophies. And the philosophies they have, their difference, relates to the role of the Western idea of a state. There are groups like Hamas, which very much espouse the idea of a state. They want to restore the state of Palestine. Whereas Al-Qaeda rejects the whole notion of states entirely. So ISIS is new in that, like you said, it split off from Al-Qaeda and what it split off from them was over this question of what role should an Islamist organization play. Al-Qaeda is engaged in fighting a war. And that is mostly what they're engaged in. They weren't so concerned with establishing or reestablishing some kind of caliphate. And ISIS, like you said, split off from them and from other groups fighting in Syria, like Jabhat al-Nusra. And they actually took that next step and actually conquered territory and held territory, started doing things that states do, having borders and guards and having to deal with more mundane aspects of the state like trash collection. So yes, it's new in the sense that in the Islamist wave that has been gaining traction, certainly not among all Muslims, in fact, not among most Muslims, but among a certain segment of Muslims, particularly disaffected and disenchanted with the West, and more advocating of what they feel is an authentic form of governance. ISIS does present something new in that they actually took that next step and made themselves a state, even though they don't have the recognition of the international community, and they don't really have the approval, but one presumes, of the majority of their population.
Okay, good. Thank you. Dr. Davis, people have argued that ISIS has sprung from U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. What is U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, and how has it changed over time?
Well, thanks for inviting me to the panel first, I'd like to say. But the United States foreign policy is centered on three positions, and these are the three interests. The first is oil, the second is protecting Israel, and the third is countering terrorism. And so all of these play a role in the way that we approach the Islamic State. And if we go back and look at the history that you introduced at the beginning, in 2003, there was in fact no presence of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. So Iraq, Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with the attacks of 9/11, nor was Al-Qaeda there. After the US invades, and this would have to be an unintended consequence, it's something certainly the Bush administration didn't plan, but after that happens, Al-Qaeda comes in. And as we see this institution emerge, we see at first it's Zarqawi from Jordan who comes in and who heads it, but institutionally it evolves, and in 2010 it becomes the Islamic State. So this was something that clearly the neoconservatives did not intend when they created this policy, and yet it happened. Secondly, we have to look at the Obama administration, because the Obama administration also made some mistakes. The first would be the organization of the executive branch. As Obama became president, he was more content to focus on domestic policy, not foreign policy. And so what he did is he structured the executive office so that those who took charge of Iraq were 3 layers removed. And so as Iraq started to do bad in 2010, there was no way for the people who were in charge of Iraq to directly report to Obama. This is the first issue. And so in 2014, when al-Baghdadi goes and conquers Mosul, and then they announce the proclamation of the Islamic State in July of that year, the United States we weren't prepared for that. It was a surprise, and we were not really able to do a response. Secondly, there's another part of this. With those 3 interests that the United States has, this also prevents us from forming a very clear and coherent policy. First, we have to make sure that our policy coincides with what Israel wants and Israeli security. And the interesting thing is that Israel wants Assad to survive, not a Sunni regime to take that place. Secondly, with our relationships with the Arab states, in particular Saudi Arabia, they want us to push for a regime change, to remove Assad and have Syria become a Sunni state. And Sunni is majority Sunni, so Bashar al-Assad is simply a minority leader. But this places the US in a very difficult position. And so I'd say the biggest weakness of the Obama administration from 2014 to the present is the inability to create a policy to deal with this. And if we look at the troops, for example, we've trained, which we've spent billions of dollars on, the first group, they were betrayed by the Turks, and they ended up actually being given over to the Islamic State. The second group, which was trained last week, ended up surrendering to Al-Qaeda. And so the arms that we provided to these rebels ended up, first group going to the ISIS state, the second going to Al-Qaeda. And if we look, we know that that policy has been a failure. But the real question, I think, is why? And the reason it's a failure is because we have our hands tied. We have to please both Israel and the Arabs, which means that both of these regional partners want different outcomes. And so we have to do something, but we're not doing enough to change. And so that's, we can look back, and to answer your question, that's how U.S. policy helped inadvertently create the Islamic State, and how we can look at the last two presidential administrations and blame ISIS, or blame the two presidents for the emergence of ISIS.
Okay. And building off of that, now the situation has become even more tenuous in Syria, General Gavan, with Russia having entered in and causing the U.S. headaches in Syria. And Russia has now entered the conflict by bombing both ISIS and opponents of Bashar al-Assad's regime. How effective do you think an air campaign will be at defeating ISIS itself?
Well, an air campaign can be effective. The question is which air campaign, what kind, what are the features of that air campaign? Because it's not one size fits all. Some of the critics, including some friends of mine, retired Air Force officers, have had a problem with the intensity of the campaign. That is, how many targets we're hitting, how fast we're hitting them. Airmen generally prefer high-intensity campaigns that are really keep the pressure on an enemy. In this particular case, a lot of people have had problems with how long it's taken to get targets approved, how quickly we're hitting them, how often we're revisiting those targets, keeping pressure. Certainly can, and you need intelligence on the ground, because naturally that's the biggest thing, is what are the good targets, so that you can hit, whether it's restricting their mobility by hitting convoys or finding arms caches or whatever it might be that they hold precious. Now, with the entrance of the Russians, this is really complicated matters, because really the Russians would love to see ISIS taken care of, but I think they're perfectly content for us to take care of them. So my sense of this is that the Russians really are focused on the more traditional enemies of the Assad regime. And we are not, to my knowledge, sharing any intelligence with the Russians. What we are doing is coordination with the Russians. So this ends up being more of a geographically separated sort of thing. And okay, if we're flying, how do we let each other know? How do we make sure we're coordinating? But it is not a harmoniously orchestrated, combined air campaign between Russians and the United States. That being said, certainly they can be effective air campaigns. I think ISIS, of course, adapts. The enemy always gets a vote, as we say. So again, part of this is how do you adapt as well, and what do you do to overcome what they're doing? But certainly an air campaign can be a very effective strategy.
Okay. And do you think that ISIS can be defeated with an air campaign, or do you think you need boots on the ground?
Well, the question is defeated and dislodged. I think what you generally do need is both an air and a ground element to any of this. Who needs to be on the ground? That becomes the question. Can someone fulfill that role, or is it an indispensable role that has to be fulfilled by U.S. troops? Now, the other thing I want to mention too, as we talk about this, I think we tend to talk more about Syria, but one of the things that ISIS has done, of course, which complicates things, is they've crossed borders. So now this becomes transnational, and we have to worry about ISIS in Iraq or ISIS in Syria. How do we coordinate across that? In Iraq, obviously much easier to coordinate with Iraqi ground forces and use them. Not as easy in Syria.
Okay, good. I want to open up the same type of question to the whole panel, which is, first of all, can ISIS be defeated, since it's really swelled up from the ground? Even if you defeat them militarily, will they go away? Will you defeat them? And if so, how do you think?
Well, I think ISIS can be defeated because if you look at its theology is apocalyptic, so it believes it will lose. ISIS is not an organization that believes it's going to win. It's trying to usher in the apocalypse, and they think there's going to be 12 caliphs. Al-Baghdadi, the current head, would be the 8th. So they don't expect to win, actually, militarily. That's the strange thing about this. And it will, I believe, falter out because there's no allies, no borders, it can make no agreement. So the biggest enemy that it has in the international system is itself. The question then becomes, and if we're too aggressive at defeating ISIS, the real problem, I think, is there's 30,000 fighters there that have joined the Islamic State with a main army corps of 18,000. Al-Qaeda during its heyday had about 3,000. So if, in fact, the Islamic State is defeated, all these people then go back to the West or go back to other countries and cause, really a lot of havoc. And so it's almost a strategic thing to keep it in place until it defeats itself. It is one of these strange issues, but just defeating it with air power alone, it's not going to happen. I don't believe that'll be sufficient. And the other part of this is it's a much bigger problem for the Arab states than it is for us. Their biggest enemy, first off, would be the Shia population. Their second biggest enemy is the Arab head of states, which they wish to target more than the West. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's the primary goal, which means that in a sense we're a little bit fortunate in the regard. Al-Qaeda was much more aggressive in targeting us, so we have a different institutional bearing. And I know I jumped around in the answer, but I think that air power by itself can't do it. And I don't think that we're going to stop ISIS with our current policies.
I'd like to take that a step further and suggest that actually fighting ISIS may even be the wrong approach. One of the ways that ISIS likes to market itself to all these recruits that you mentioned, all these people who are coming in from people who aren't even Muslim, coming in from all over the world, is that they are the ones who are standing up to the West, and specifically now to America. It is an ideology that flourishes in conflict with the West, specifically with America. So by bombing them, yes, we can weaken them militarily, but we do nothing to undercut their ideology. We do nothing to undercut their marketing message, which is, I think, the biggest problem, the fact that they have this flow of recruits that doesn't seem to be drying up. So if we play into the role they want us to play, then in essence, we're helping their marketing campaign. And that, to me, is dangerous. That said, I do think there's a military solution to the problem. I just don't know if we're the ones who are in a position to provide it.
I think that's the complicated thing. I do think we have to bring military force to bear, but I think we have to be creative in the approaches that we do that. Let's be frank. People are suffering under them. People are dying under their rule. Cultural sites, world cultural sites, history are being destroyed under their rule, and I don't think anyone wants to see that continue. So. It really is a question of creative military strategies, I think. But military part is only one component of any strategy that we would pursue. So just as I would say, no, air power alone is not going to be an answer, but certainly it's part of an answer, and it's a way that we can put pressure on them right now. Ground elements definitely needed as part of this. The air and ground work very effectively together as we bring pressure to bear. But there also is, I think, this larger part of and the difficult problem of how we really coordinate a strategy among a group of nations, in some cases, that have very different perspectives on what needs to be done or how much needs to be done.
Well, I think what we need are not just, and again, I'm reticent about whether it should be our troops and our planes doing the bombing. Someone's going to do it at some point, is going to step it up, and probably not the Russians, because ISIS is kind of doing what they want, I think. But what we really need are an army of lawyers and theologians from the Islamic world who can attack the ideology, who can show the ideology to be bankrupt, or as many of my friends and colleagues call it, the un-Islamic state, because so many of the things it does are absolutely counter to what most people, other than them, consider to be Islamic law. That is really the front lines, and that's really what is ultimately going to defeat ISIS, is an ideology. Military, we can rein in these people, but the only way to stop it as an ideology, as a way of thought, is for other Muslims to attack the ideology itself.
So how do we get that? How do we encourage other Muslims to attack it as an ideology?
We don't. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, there's two things. First off, there was a successful program of Muslims doing this in Cairo to discredit Al-Qaeda. And so with Al-Qaeda, all the leaders had no theological background, so it was pretty easy to discredit that, just to get someone who's actually studied the Quran, and they could discredit it. With ISIS, we have another problem, because al-Baghdadi, the leader of it, has a doctorate in Islamic thought from the University of Baghdad, which means that he has some religious credentials. And this makes our task a little bit more difficult. I do think it's very possible, but the real people who have to do this are the Sunnis. And secondly, I'd like to say there's one more focus that we really have to really have an answer to before we can defeat ISIS, and that's we have to settle the civil war in Syria. If the civil war in Syria is not settled, there's no way that the Islamic State can be defeated. So it's just, that has to be first. And right now, this is something where, if we're really honest with our own country, we don't really have a policy that can do that. And so we're not really in a condition, and I mean, yeah, we can always pick people off, but we're not going to end ISIS. And I do think there does have to be a military engagement as well, but the reality is that's certainly not enough.
Well, and there's so many different elements in the Syrian civil war. It's hard to pick who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, right?
The enemy of my enemy of my enemy
yes.
is still my enemy, actually.
Exactly. So I think that speaks to one reason why the U.S. hasn't had a coordinated policy in Syria, because it's hard to figure out how to do it. We want ISIS to lose, but we also want al-Assad to lose. And who do we pick as the proper elements who are fighting him? And I think that makes it very, very difficult.
Correct. And we have to also, when we look at the United States, we've had mixed policies and mixed messages about what to do with Assad, because we've had a few trial balloons that have leaked that the future of Syria would be okay if Assad remains in power. And so we're really not clear, although I think that that policy is really dictated by our allies. And so in order to keep our Sunni allies satisfied, in particular Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, we have to keep doing what we're doing. But this is not going to solve the conflict. And so we're, in a sense, we don't have a strategy. That has to be the first thing. That's what we lack as a country, a strategy to deal with both the Syrian civil war and ISIS.
And the entrance of the Russians, of course, has very much complicated things, because with them coming in and very much looking like they're going to prop up Assad and stand by him for at least the foreseeable future, now that changes the calculation on what really is possible in terms of any sort of transition to a settlement. I think it's going to take a while for that to work itself out, and for us to adjust with our Sunni allies and to understand what really is the art of the possible here.
Great. Well, I know that we obviously haven't resolved everything here on this in this panel, but I really appreciate everyone joining me and certainly making it clear as to what is going on, even if we haven't resolved the crisis ourselves. So I want to thank the panel very much, and I know that this is an evolving situation, and I know that we'll probably have to meet at least once more, if not a lot more often, as events unfold in Syria as well as with ISIS. And so I think this is something that will evolve a lot more in the future, and we'll see what happens. So thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you.
To view this and other Troy Trojan Vision programs online, check out our YouTube page at youtube.com/Troy Trojan Vision. To find out when new programs are uploaded, like us on Facebook.